Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here and to have this chance to provide this introduction to U.S. policy for climate and heritage. I want to start with a conversation that I had in early summer 2015 with climate staff at the U.S. State Department. This conversation went approximately like this. State Department, wait, you work with cultural heritage and climate change? Me, yes. They went on to tell me that they were part of the U.S. team negotiating the Paris Agreement. And in these negotiations, several of the small island developing states in the Pacific were raising the issue of loss of their cultural heritage as seas rise, and they wanted this issue addressed in the Paris Agreement. The State Department staff told me they weren't sure how to respond. Now, at the time, I was with the U.S. National Park Service in the role of Climate Change Adaptation Coordinator for Cultural Resources. In this role, my responsibilities were to figure out what climate change was doing and will do to all of the cultural resources that the Park Service manages and for which it provides guidance, and what to do about all of it. As you may know, the Park Service is the lead U.S. federal agency for cultural heritage, as assigned by several pieces of legislation. Therefore, my remit covered not only every one of the more than 400 units of the National Park System, but also coordination with other federal agencies, states, tribes, and the guidance sent to local governments. As part of this, I was reaching out to a range of federal agencies, asking what they were doing for cultural heritage and climate and what challenges they were seeing. Key point here being, I was the one who found the contacts at the State Department. They had not found me. What I explained to them in the moment was, my program didn't have all of the answers yet, but yes, cultural heritage and climate change is a thing. The Park Service was working on it, and we had some policies and other materials. What they replied, once I'd explained it, is that it made sense to them that the Park Service was working on heritage and climate, but it had not occurred to them to look to the Park Service for information and guidance that they needed. To them, the Park Service is about big nature-focused parks, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, and Yosemite. What it felt was something like this. Now, there are 3 points I want to pull from this story. First is, the State Department needed heritage support for climate, and it didn't know where to look for it. Second, this kickstarted my work in trying to understand the history and context of U.S. federal structures for heritage, including issues of visibility and accessibility, and how this history and context shapes what U.S. agencies do and what happens beyond them. And 3, the U.S. is a gorilla in the global climate space. What the U.S. does and doesn't do, does and doesn't talk about, and does and doesn't value has impact far beyond the U.S. These 3 together are the foundation for what I'm sharing with you today. Now, I came to DC in 2009 as a Science and Technology Policy Fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, known as AAAS. One of the first things our orientation started with is that connections of science and policy go in multiple directions. Now, researchers, and by this I mean everyone who develops and shares forms of knowledge and information, often focus on science for policy, by which I mean presenting multiple forms of knowledge and information to policymakers so that those policymakers can, we hope, use that knowledge and information to make good decisions. But there's another direction that also needs our attention, and this is science for policy. Policy for science. This direction sets what research is understood as needed, how it should be managed and funded, and it tends to set what policymakers look for from science. In brief, it filters what they are expecting to hear and take in. So as we look to move forward with heritage in relation to climate, understanding the history that has shaped U.S. policy perspectives of both heritage and climate are an important part of doing this. Now, U.S. legislation for heritage goes back more than a century. The 1906 Antiquities Act was the first major piece. It was passed due to efforts to prevent looting of archaeological sites and pueblos in the American Southwest. With this background, it focused on historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic and scientific interest. And it used the method of drawing a boundary around objects and withdrawing those areas from development and daily use. The 1916 Organic Act is sort of inverse heritage legislation because it established the National Park Service, but it did not set the National Park Service as a heritage agency at this time. Multiple Civil War battlefields remained the property of what was then the War Department. The Organic Act does reference historic objects, and it continued the practice of designating areas of importance by drawing a boundary around them and withdrawing them from regular daily use. The 1935 Historic Sites Act was passed at the request of President Franklin Roosevelt, who wanted to bring the U.S. up to par with European countries that had named heritage ministries. The Historic Sites Act set the NPS as the lead federal agency for heritage, and it set up new mechanisms for identifying historic properties for preservation and then bringing them into the federal system. But it did not change the name of the Park Service. It kept the focus on historic sites, buildings, and objects of national significance, and it kept the primary mechanisms of boundary drawing and applying significance designations. The 1966 National Historic Preservation Act, or NHPA, is the largest piece of U.S. heritage legislation so far. It was passed in large part due to recognition of the destruction of historic cores of towns and cities due to so-called urban renewal and construction of the interstate highway system in the 1950s and early 1960s. The NHPA did many things, and what I'll mention here is the establishment of the National Register of Historic Places, which set definitions for integrity and significance. It set up the Section 106 process, which is our polluter pays process for considering the impacts of development on National Register eligible places, and it created the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation and a national system of state historic preservation offices to oversee this. The operative word throughout the NHPA is historic property, historic property, historic property. The 1990 Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, set out long-needed rights of tribes to burials and related materials, but it didn't change the other major structures for heritage that had been established earlier in the 20th century. Now, there have been several amendments to the NHPA, and there have been other bills addressing other heritage issues. But I will argue here that these are the pieces of legislation that really set out major agency roles, organized and directed funding, and established a new baseline of tribal rights in the case of NAGPRA. Now, in setting these up, the U.S. wasn't alone. And also, as I mentioned at the start, what happens in the U.S. doesn't tend to stay only here. These approaches to heritage also were used through the middle and later 20th century in an international context, including the establishment of ICROM in Rome in 1946, the International Council on Monuments and Sites in 1966, and the World Heritage Convention in 1972. In 2003, the UN passed the Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Heritage, but the U.S. is not a signatory to this, hence the red. Now, Dr. Laura Jane Smith, who I am putting here in the upper right-hand corner, has gathered the language and approaches of these pieces of legislation and the practices that these organizations have pulled together and put into use. And she proposes that together they have collectively created essentially a default definition of heritage. By default definition, she means this is what heritage is generally understood to mean when it isn't otherwise defined, and sometimes even when it is. She calls this default definition the Authorized Heritage Discourse, or AHD. And very briefly, this definition says that heritage is things that are grand, they're tangible and old, aesthetically pleasing, sites, monuments, and buildings, things that are great and good, they have inherent value, we conserve them as they are found, we steward a universal past, and they are fragile, finite, and non-renewable. Now, I had the chance to see Dr. Smith present this at a conference in early 2022, and the light bulb moment was intense because she had just put a name to what I had lived inside for 7 years. For all that colleagues in many areas of heritage know that history and heritage are more than this list of characteristics, the concept she's included in this outline of the Authorized Heritage Discourse is the understanding of heritage that so many people and processes across the U.S. government brought to conversations that I was in during my time with the Park Service. So for me, this definition rings very true. And it means that stepping back to the policy and science cycle, the components of the Authorized Heritage Discourse have come out of U.S. legislation, and they set perceptions of policymakers for heritage. And this is a concern because this has many consequences, including the very real consequences of how and where money is and is not spent in annual appropriation cycles and other major initiatives. For example, in August of 2022, U.S. Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, which, despite the name, is the largest climate bill to date in the U.S. While the majority of climate provisions in the IRA are for renewable energy development, toward the end, under the heading of natural resources, it also directs close to $1 billion to the Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management for climate conservation. According to the wording of the bill, the implementing regulations, and every other source I've been able to ask or check, none of this money is directed to be used for cultural heritage. This should concern all of us. We should be asking why. I will note that I've recently seen some word that the Park Service may be directing some of its IRA funding to cultural resources, and if Andy Farrell is on this call, he may know more. But there has not been external information that I have been able to find about how much, towards what priorities, and generally I will maintain invisibility in legislation is not a good thing. Now, in response to the question of why it took this shape, there's one answer that I will share here. And with the example of the authorized heritage discourse, I propose that there is also an authorized climate discourse, an ACD, and it is also developed, at least in part, out of U.S. federal documents, legislation, and other actions. These include the 1988 testimony of climate scientist James Hansen to the U.S. Senate, which emphasized climate measurements and models. In 1990, the U.S. Global Change Research Act established the U.S. Global Change Research Program and the U.S. National Climate Assessment. It defines global change as the changes in the global environment, such as land productivity, oceans, water resources, atmospheric chemistry, and ecological systems, and it defines global change research as foremost the interactive physical, chemical, and biological processes that regulate the total Earth system. The 1988 documents that established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, use similar sets of terms and priorities. To their credit, I think this opening set of priorities recognizes socioeconomic impacts in a way that the text of the U.S. Global Change Research Program does not. From these, a summary of the authorized climate discourse can look something like this, or I think it looks something like this. It says climate change is climate models and projections. It's measurement of emissions, their impacts and their change, energy and water, supply use and infrastructure, technology across multiple sectors, it's extreme events, and it's the governments and economics regarding all of these. Now, as we work to link history and heritage to climate change and policy, one of our challenges is, if we take the authorized heritage discourse and the authorized climate discourse, and we put them next together, and we attempt to draw a Venn diagram, I suggest that the result looks like this. It's possible to draw them as touching, with the connection touch point being the point of impacts, but they do not overlap. Now, if we set this back on our science and policy cycle, this lack of overlap is a filter that we have to keep in mind as we try to move forward with history and heritage and climate, because it sets up the constraints in terms of policy and funding. This is really frustrating because, of course, there is much more overlap between all that history and heritage are and what they can do for and with climate change that should be addressed and incorporated into policy. There are several ways of building and showing this overlap, and the work that many of you are doing with buildings and embodied carbon and the CARE tool show how much this is needed. What I'm going to share here is one of the ways of building overlap that comes from the body of community-based and archaeological work that I have been doing. Returning briefly to the small island developing states, what they are raising in the Paris negotiations that my State Department colleagues were grappling with was not preservation of examples of architecturally admirable buildings, but rather recognition of the risk to the whole of their cultures and the depths of their connections to the places in which they live, and their goal to incorporate these into the political processes of global climate negotiations. Recently here in the US, the National Academies has released a report on community-driven relocation along the Gulf Coast. One of the central concepts recognized in this report is place attachment. And several speakers in the event that launched this report summarized this eloquently by asking, how do I remain myself in the midst of all of this change? Laura Jane Smith has suggested an alternate definition of heritage, one that moves beyond the authorized heritage discourse, and which she has developed from years of talking with a range of people and communities about their connections to place and past. In my read, this alternate definition of heritage captures what the small island developing states and the communities along the U.S. Gulf Coast are saying about what they are facing and about what they want. Her alternate definition of heritage is, and I'm just going to say the first part, it says heritage is a process in which people negotiate the meaning of the past to address contemporary social and political problems and navigate change. Now, in turn, it's also possible to craft an alternate definition of climate change. While legislation, testimony, and a growing stack of climate change reports have generated the authorized climate discourse, if we listen to many of the leaders of the global climate response, Christiana Figueres, who led the Paris Agreement, Jim Ski, who's the new chair of the IPCC, and Michał Kurtyka, who is chair of COP24 in Poland, they are saying something different. They are saying that the challenge of climate change lies not in building more scientific models and data, but in the human capacities for cooperation and our capacity to build a vision and hope of a different world, a path of deep but just transition, inclusive participation and collaboration, engagement with policymakers and other stakeholders. In brief, what is most needed is not more science in and of itself, but rather the social and political will to act. If we take these two new definitions and we set them side by side, we can see that they have far more in common with each other than their older legislative definitions. So as we work with history and heritage and climate and look towards policy, awareness and articulation of what definitions we are using and what definitions those to whom we most want to speak are using can be a path to greater leverage. They also point in directions for action. I recently completed an analysis of 27 federal agency climate adaptation plans that were prepared in response to the Biden administration Executive Order 14008, released by the White House in late 2021 and early 2022. Briefly noting, this analysis was recently published in PNAS along with the legislative history and the Venn diagrams I've just shared with you. So all of the details are there, and I'm just summarizing them here. I did a keyword search of each agency plan using the terms culture, cultural, heritage, historic, indigenous, and traditional. And I pulled each occurrence of them out of each plan and analyzed their use. Two overarching findings. First, more than half of the plans, 16 out of 27, had at least one heritage-relevant use of a keyword. As I mentioned at the start, the Park Service is the lead federal agency for heritage in the U.S. The Park Service is part of Department of the Interior. The Interior Plan is only one of these 16, so there are 15 other departments and agencies that also mention responsibilities for heritage as part of their plans for climate. Second, Executive Order 14008 did not ask for attention to heritage as part of these climate plans, so every one of these mentions was volunteered. In more detail, I also looked at whether each keyword use followed more of an authorized discourse model, meaning it addressed solely or primarily impacts, or an alternate discourse model, looking at roles of heritage as part of community meaning, equity, and knowledge. And these results were that Interior, the agency whose heritage roles are most defined by the history of heritage legislation, nearly 75% of their keyword uses addressed impacts-related issues, basically following the authorized heritage discourse. And this was similar for other agencies that have large real estate roles, like the General Services Administration and the Veterans Administration. But only a third of the Smithsonian's keyword uses addressed impacts. And for 4 agencies, including Transportation, Environmental Protection Agency, Housing and Urban Development, and Millennium Challenge Corporation, their only references to cultural heritage were in the alternate discourse approaches. Now, these results are both critical for efforts and they are part of our challenge. For our efforts, these show that complex engagement with heritage and meanings for history is possible in a U.S. federal environment. Our challenge is to link to them and to help grow and guide them. And there's now even more reason to do so. The Inflation Reduction Act used an authorized discourse frame to the extent that it didn't even recognize the impacts part of cultural heritage as being part of climate conservation. In October of 2022, I raised concerns about the Inflation Reduction Act and its lack of funding and attention to cultural heritage in an op-ed. As I said, we should all be concerned, and in this op-ed I explained why. Shortly thereafter, the Office of Representative Tonko reached out to me and asked what legislation was needed to follow up on this, which is a great question to be asked. And we've continued the conversation over the year and a half since. In April of 2024, this year, Representative Tonko introduced H.R. 7936, the Cultural Resources Challenge Act. In my read, unfortunately, the direction of this bill has been captured by the authorized discourses. It focuses solely on the National Park Service, and in my read, continues the authorized heritage discourse approach to federal action for heritage. Again, I know we have colleagues who are with the National Park Service who likely have different perspectives on this bill, which is why I think it's good for us to know about this and to develop ways to talk about what is in the bill and what is not. Now, there is much more background that I have on this bill than I can share here. If there is interest, hopefully we can discuss more down the line. For the moment, I want to share and close with two final ideas. First, in mid-April, I had the chance to meet with Representative Tonko's staff who drafted this bill. I was there in collaboration with the National Association for Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, and we both raised polite but strong concerns. The congressional staff said in reply that while this bill has been introduced, they don't expect it to pass this Congress, and at this point they are not looking for co-sponsors for it. What they emphasized is they want this bill to be the start of a conversation. So we have an opportunity to be part of this. Second, returning once more to this timeline, there are two more features that I want you to see. And while each of these pieces of legislation was passed in response to issues recognized in their time, they also have been passed at a tempo of about once approximately every 30 years, essentially once a generation. We are now 34 years past the initial passage of NAGPRA. And yet further, the major federal structures for heritage in the U.S. were set up before major recognition of climate change. So I suggest it is time to ask, what are the major challenges of our time, such as climate change, that are not addressed by existing heritage legislation? How should they be addressed? What definitions and structures do we need in this spot so that information from and about history and heritage are a much fuller part of this cycle? So that all the history and heritage, particularly from this state and group, buildings, what they can do and what they need to do for climate are part of this cycle. I have started to put together my vision for starting actions, and these are just a brief list of the ones I put in the PNAS paper. I'm now also working with the Society for Historical Archaeology to help them build a larger conversation and voice for archaeology in relation to climate and policy. If it is possible to build some parallel conversations with and across CHN, I would be very interested to explore how we might do that. So with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for the chance to share all of this with you, and I look forward to a chance to discuss and questions you might have. So again, thank you so much.